Okay, so you've probably seen the documentary, right? But beyond all the family drama, there's a really troubling scientific puzzle at the heart of the Kathleen Peterson case. And that's what we're going to do today. We're doing a pure forensic reconstruction, stripping away all the narratives to just follow the hard evidence, no matter where it leads.
See, this whole 20-year mystery really boils down to one central question. What actually caused Kathleen Peterson's death? Was it a tragic, unlucky fall down a narrow staircase? Was it a brutal murder at the hands of her husband? Or, and this is where it gets strange, could the answer be something else entirely? Something nobody even considered at the time?
All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. We're going to move through 6 key parts. First, we'll look at the puzzling scene itself and the prosecution's homicide theory. Then, we'll dive into the contradictory evidence that starts to poke holes in that story, putting the science itself on trial. And finally, we'll explore a very surprising theory that, believe it or not, just might explain everything.
So let's go right back to the beginning, December 9, 2001. When police first arrived at the Peterson mansion, their immediate gut reaction was suspicion. I mean, before any real forensic analysis was done, the consensus in the room was clear. There was just way too much blood for this to be a simple accident. And that single assumption, it would shape the entire investigation from that moment on.
The official story starts with Michael Peterson's frantic 911 call at 2:40 in the morning. He says his wife had an accident, that she fell, but he insists she's still breathing. But here's the first huge problem. When paramedics arrive just minutes later, the scene tells a very different story. The blood around Kathleen's body isn't fresh. It's already coagulated. It's dry. It's sticky. And that immediately tells them that the injuries happened a long time before that 911 call was ever made.
Now, the prosecution had a tough job ahead of them. They had no confession, and they never, ever found a murder weapon. So they had to build a powerful circumstantial case. And they did. They wove this really compelling story of a marriage that was secretly on the brink of collapse, ending that night in a violent explosion. The prosecution's motive really had 2 main pillars. First, there was the money. The Petersons were what you'd call house-rich and cash-poor, with over $143,000 in credit card debt. And Kathleen, who was the primary earner, had a life insurance policy worth $1.4 million. The second pillar? Secrets. The state argued that on the night she died, Kathleen discovered Michael's secret life, his bisexuality, and that he was emailing with a male escort, and that this discovery triggered the argument that turned fatal.
And this is how the prosecution basically turned the blood itself into their smoking gun. They had their star expert, an FBI agent named Dwayne Deaver, testify that all the tiny blood stains on the wall were medium-velocity impact spatter. Now, if you're a juror hearing that, it sounds definitive, doesn't it? It sounds like scientific proof that she was beaten to death with some kind of blunt object.
Then, to really seal the deal, the prosecution reached way back, 18 years back, to the death of a family friend in Germany, Elizabeth Ratliff. And get this, she was also found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Her death was originally ruled a stroke, but for this trial, her body was exhumed, and her cause of death was officially changed to homicide, allowing the state to paint this picture of Michael Peterson as a serial staircase killer.
Okay, so the prosecution story sounds pretty convincing, right? But this is where things get interesting. When you stop listening to the story and you start looking at the hard physical evidence from the autopsy, the whole narrative just begins to completely fall apart.
Now, this might be the most crucial scientific fact in the entire case. The autopsy found something called red neurons in Kathleen's brain. So what are those? They're damaged cells that only form when a person survives for at least 90 to 120 minutes after a brain injury. This means she didn't die instantly in some blitz attack. She was lying there, dying for up to 2 hours. And that completely shatters the prosecution's timeline.
The prosecution claimed that these 7 deep lacerations on the back of her head were the result of at least 7 distinct blows from some kind of weapon.
And here we have the central paradox of the whole case. 7 blows, supposedly hard enough to kill her, and yet they resulted in 0 skull fractures. No bruises on the brain, no internal bleeding whatsoever. Biomechanically, that's considered nearly impossible. A fatal beating like that should have caused catastrophic damage to her skull, but there was none. The prosecution also pointed to a tiny fracture in her neck cartilage as proof of strangulation, but that kind of injury can also happen in a fall if your head snaps back violently. And most importantly, the autopsy found no petechial hemorrhages. Those are the tiny burst blood vessels in the eyes that are the absolute classic sign of strangulation. So the physical evidence for that claim, it just wasn't there. So the entire case against Peterson was built on this foundation of forensic science. But years later, that foundation would just crumble. And it revealed a story not of scientific certainty,
but of systemic corruption.
Remember Dwayne Deaver, the prosecution's blood spatter expert? Well, a 2010 audit of the State Bureau of Investigation revealed he was, to put it mildly, a fraud. He had withheld crucial evidence in hundreds of cases. He lied about his credentials on the stand. He even faked his experiments to get the results he wanted. It was a total mess.
The bottom line is that the science that convicted Michael Peterson was junk science. The trial judge, when he learned about Deaver's fraud, threw out the conviction entirely, calling the original testimony, and I'm quoting here, materially misleading and deliberately false. Without that testimony, the state's entire case just collapsed.
Okay, so with the homicide theory in ruins, we're left with this collection of bizarre, contradictory evidence that doesn't make sense. But what if there was one theory? And yeah, it sounds strange, but what if it could explain everything? Let's talk about the owl theory.
I know, it sounds absurd at first, but let's just walk through the sequence. The idea is that a territorial barred owl, which are very common in that area, attacked Kathleen while she was outside. Its talons created those deep, slashing cuts on her scalp. Confused and bleeding, she stumbled back inside, leaving blood on the front door, before finally collapsing on the stairs, either from shock or from slipping in her own blood.
Now, this isn't just a wild guess. It's a theory that actually explains the evidence that nothing else can. For example, microscopic owl feathers were found tangled in the hair that she was clutching in her hand. Her hair also had pine needles in it, pointing to something happening outside. And maybe most important, the shape of the wounds is a much better match for a raptor's talons than a blunt weapon. It explains the deep cuts with no skull fracture, and it finally accounts for the blood found outside the house.
So, let's put it all together. When we line up the hard physical facts, the stuff that can't be argued with, against the three competing theories, a really clear picture starts to emerge.
Just look at how this breaks down. The homicide theory fails because of the missing skull fracture and the red neuron timeline. A simple fall? Well, that just can't explain the 7 different lacerations or the feathers in her hand. It's only the owl theory, an animal attack followed by a fall, that is consistent with all of the major pieces of physical evidence. It's the only one that checks every box.
You know, the Peterson case is a chilling look at how a compelling story, when it's aided by corrupt science, can be enough to get a conviction. And it really forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If the expert testimony that seals a person's fate can be proven totally false years down the road, how many other convictions out there are resting on that same foundation of sand?